Honoring us, Ambassador Patrick Maisonneuve. It's now my pleasure to invite Jerusalem Post diplomatic correspondent Herb Keinon to interview the Prime Minister.
Good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for joining us this morning at the Jerusalem Post Diplomatic Conference. Huge events are currently taking place at dizzying pace, transforming the country, the region, and now, as we see after the attacks in Paris, the world. Your plate as the country's Prime Minister is brimming over, even more so than usual. As agreed, our conversation will focus largely on the diplomatic issues, and since your time this morning is very limited, let's just delve in. The world has been shocked and horrified by the attacks in France. What are the operative steps that you recommend be taken now by the West to deal with the jihadist radicals? Is it time for the West to put boots on the ground, to commit troops? And what role does Israel have to play in this war?
First, we have to understand what is terrorism. Terrorism is the deliberate and systematic targeting of the innocent, of civilians, of non-combatants, for political or ideological ends. This is what defines terrorism. It's always evil. It's the nature of the act. Disqualifies it. And this is what constitutes the essence of war crimes. The deliberate targeting, not of combatants, but of civilians, is the essence of war crimes. And terrorism is therefore a war crime. It's always a war crime. So there are no good terrorists and no bad terrorists. There are only bad terrorists. Palestinians here, or Islamists on the streets of Paris, equally guilty. That's very important to have that moral clarity. That's the underpinning of the battle against terrorism. Second, this terrorism is being used increasingly by militant Islam. It's not all of Islam, and many Muslims, mostly Muslims are numerically have been the majority of its victims, but it is militant Islam of its two branches, the militant Shiites led by Iran and the militant Sunnis led by Daesh that are fomenting this carnage, both in the Middle East and in Africa and on the streets of Europe. The enemy is militant Islam. Its method, so far, is terrorism. It is in the business of acquiring states. One already exists. It's called the Islamic State of Iran, and the second is being established. It's called the Islamic State of ISIS, Daesh. And with states, the Islamist militants can have a base from which to launch much greater and more lethal terrorism. So that's the second point. What is the method? Terrorism. Who's the propagator? Increasingly, militant Islam of both views. What is the system to fight them? One thing. Fight them. Condemn them. Identify, condemn, fight. What does that mean? I'm not going to tell you what is the mixture of air power, ground power, and other means to fight these people. I am saying that you're not going to change them. You will not win them over. You will not pacify them. The only way to defeat this is the way Nazism was defeated. First you defeat, then you denazify. That's the order. That's the priority. And it must be now a common agenda to defeat the forces of militant Islam and not to compromise with them.
So you're saying now there needs to be ground forces?
The actual decision of how you employ power is critical, but I'll leave it to discussions between governments, including the ones we'll probably have around the upcoming conference in Paris.
And what about Israel's role? I mean, what's our role in that?
We should play our role.
The Swedish foreign minister made comments Monday about the Paris attacks, implying that if there would just be a solution to the Palestinian issue, then the swamps of terror could be drained. She's not alone in that sentiment, obviously. How do you respond to that?
That's a fundamental misunderstanding of the sources of terrorism. The Middle East is disintegrating. States are disappearing. Iraq no longer exists. Syria no longer exists. Yemen no longer exists. Libya doesn't exist any longer, and so many other countries are in upheaval. That is not coming because of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is a subset, not a particularly important one, of this general upheaval. The upheaval and the source of this conflict is the battle between modernity and medievalism, early medievalism, and very violent one. That is shaking the Arab-Muslim world in a fundamental way. And these historic forces, which were bubbling underground and burst to the surface, they were contained for a century by a system of authoritarian states, first by a colonial system and then a post-colonial authoritarian state system. That is broken down, and all these forces are bursting through the sand, through the cracks, and dislocating the Middle East and North Africa as we know them, and having a huge impact on Europe and many other lands. That's the source of the conflict. Within that, there is a battle that is ongoing for about a century between the Jewish national movement and the Palestinians who refuse to accept it. And the source of that is the persistent refusal to accept a Jewish polity, Jewish sovereignty in any border. Lately, this Palestinian rejectionism is fused with militant Islam. You see that in that half the Palestinian people are now governed in Gaza by militant Islamists, Sunnis aligned with Iran, doing Iran's bidding, Islamic Jihad doing Iran's bidding. And the other half refuses to fight the first half and refuses to make its final peace or bury the hatchet with Israel. So the larger picture, modernity against medievalism. In our part of the Middle Eastern woods, the persistent refusal to accept Israel in any border. These are facts. For a long time, the larger picture was subsumed by our own conflict, and people said things that were incredibly stupid. They said that the conflict in the Middle East, the conflict, always in the singular, the core of the conflict in the Middle East was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's ridiculous. It always was ridiculous, but it's particularly ridiculous today. And I'll tell you, that I think most people understand by now. I mean, there are some true believers walking around in, I don't know, certain academic circles and apparently some diplomatic circles, but they're few. And yet, it's particularly obnoxious, when they accuse us, the victims, of the terrorism that is leveled against us. We're not to blame. 100 years of terrorism leveled at us with the purpose of destroying us? We're not to blame, any more than the people of Paris are to blame for the attacks that have been leveled against them, okay? So obviously we reject that. But now there's a new twist. It's not merely that we are to blame for the terrorism that is directed against us. We are to blame for the terrorism that is directed against them in Paris. Now that's a level of absurdity that is almost comic if it weren't so tragic. We reject both.
But how about the premise that our conflict adds fuel to the ability of the radical Islamists to enlist?
It doesn't. I would say it's the opposite. Our presence here of a strong democratic Israel is one of the main stopgaps against the collapse of this part of the Middle East and the flow, by the way, of an endlessly larger number of migrants into Europe. If there weren't in Israel, you would have more militant Islam, you would have nobody to fight it. Israel is in fact the most important and the strongest bastion against militant Islam, certainly in the Middle East, but I would say in a very, very large radius. We are not the cause, we are the obstacle to militant Islam.
Mr. Prime Minister, you've called repeatedly for PA President Abu Mazen to return to the talks. He's made clear that he has no intention to do so. So what's your next move? Are you considering unilateral steps, and what do you do to prevent Israel from becoming a binational state?
Well, first of all, you point correctly that he has refused to enter negotiations without preconditions. I've been Prime Minister on this rounds. This is my fourth term, so I've been Prime Minister now. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It requires some effort, but it's nice to have that recognized early in the morning here in Jerusalem. I've been Prime Minister, this is my fourth time, third consecutive term, and I have asked from day one to negotiate without preconditions with President Abbas. After all, our situation is complex, not easy to solve. On the one hand, I don't want a binational state. I don't want to govern the Palestinians. I let them rule themselves. On the other, I don't want to have territory that is in their power to be used as another state, the Iranian state, to attack Israel, as has happened in Gaza, as has happened in Lebanon after we left it. This requires an arrangement of arrangements of recognition, of demilitarization by us. I mean, I'm the foreign minister and I'm going out on a limb. I'm telling you, it's not going to be done by Austrian forces, okay? It's just not going to happen, okay? So the only force that can assure continuous demilitarization in the foreseeable future are the security forces of Israel, which is complicated, but essential. By the way, essential not only for our security, but essential also for Palestinian security. Because you saw what happens when we just walked away from Gaza. Militant Islam walked in, and Hamas, with the backing of Iran, kicked out the Palestinian Authority in no time. So we can't afford to let that happen. This is one of many issues that need to be negotiated. But we can't start the negotiations. In the last 7 years, Mr. Abbas has deigned to meet with me for less than 7 hours. Simply will not meet. Now, it used to be that, of course, we were accused of the lack of diplomatic progress because that's the automaticity that accompanies some of the diplomatic circles, particularly in Europe. But I think people are waking up to the fact that he won't negotiate. And because he won't negotiate, we can't get negotiated progress, and I think that's the essential format to do it. I have no preconditions for entering negotiations, but I have very solid principles with which to conclude negotiations. And the first thing is the Palestinians will have to finally recognize the Jewish state. They cannot ask for a nation state for themselves and not accord one to us. After all, we've only been here about 4,000 years, right? We have some connection to this land, to this city. 400 yards from here is David's city. In equal distance, this Temple Mount. It's named the Temple Mount because on this mount was a temple, the place where Abraham first visited, and Solomon built a temple. And Jesus overturned the money tables, money changers tables on that temple. Okay? That is all of this from Solomon's time to the rise of Islam, preceded Islam by 1,500 years. Temple Mount. We have some connection, modest, to this land, to this city, to this mount. And yet we recognize that there is another people here, and we're willing to forge a peace. So we need to sit down and discuss the issues of mutual recognition and real security and demilitarization. And if we can't do that, because of the persistent Palestinian refusal that is never admonished by the leading forces of the international community, and therefore Abu Mazen has no incentive to enter negotiations. In the absence of that, then, look, we have three goals. One, political. Two, security. Third, prosperity. What we cannot do politically, we can at least do for security and prosperity, and we are doing it. I've not taken a toll on the Palestinian population in the recent actions. We've kept the workflow going. We didn't shut down the territories. We're doing everything in our power to target the Palestinian killers themselves. By the way, we're doing that rather successfully. There were 85 terror incidents with 95 terrorists participating in it. We killed or captured 89, that's nearly 100%, and we'll get the remaining.
Are you considering unilateral moves?
Well, unilateral moves in security and the economy are there. We're doing them. I prefer bilateral, I prefer negotiated moves. But in the aspects of security and the economy, there's room for it. Politically, I think it's more complicated and not desirable.
But if things stay stymied diplomatically, I mean, is there something that you will initiate?
Well, there are all sorts of unilateral moves in all sorts of directions. Wait and see. And they're not necessarily in the direction that people think.
Could you be a little specific?
No. No.
Mr. Prime Minister, talks about Syria's future have begun in Vienna. What does Israel want to emerge in Syria? Who are we rooting for? And is Russia's involvement there good or bad for Israel?
I'd like to see in Syria democratic, liberal, free enterprise, modest, Luxembourg. Of course, we'd like to see.
But short of that.
Humpty Dumpty being put together again and changing his nature, even then. I don't know if it could be put together again. I think that a big question remains. For the last 4 years, my policy has been not to intervene in the Syrian internal conflict, except on two things. The first thing has been to offer, and I think we were the first country on earth to offer humanitarian aid. I ordered the setting up of a field hospital about 10 yards from our border on the Golan Heights with Syria, and we took in thousands of Syrian casualties. It's not only men, it's women, it's children, it's amputees, it's you see them with the barrel bombs. I mean, it's quite astounding. They're treated by Israeli doctors or by Druze doctors and nurses, and they're absolutely amazed. They see, I talked to some of them, they see Israelis for the first time. They were indoctrinated that these are the devils, and the devils are like angels to them, giving them life, bringing them back to life. Of course, we don't photograph them, because if a picture, a photograph of these poor people is shown, and after recovery they're given passage back to Syria, they'll be executed on the spot. So they meet this clandestine Israeli kingdom of angels. We take them to our best hospitals, operate on them, and so on. That's the first thing that we did. A massive humanitarian effort. The second, in Syria itself, I made it clear that we will not tolerate the use of Syrian territory to attack our positions in the Golan or anywhere else in Israel, to form Iran's efforts to form a second front in the Golan, and we've taken action against that, against both. Or the transfer of particularly lethal weapons, let's call them game-changing weapons, from Syria to Lebanon. This has been our long-standing policy. We act on this policy. We don't always identify these game-changing weapons when they pass from Syrian territory, courtesy of, often of Iran, and always with Hezbollah doing the transport. And if we don't see it, we are not, we don't hesitate to degrade the stocks of the Syrian army of equal or similar weaponry. This is our policy. We keep it.
How about Russia? Good or bad for us?
First, I said this to President Putin when I met him in Moscow. I said, that's exactly what we're doing. And I have a suggestion. Let's make sure that our pilots don't shoot down each other, which I think is a sensible approach. And also, let's make sure that we're coordinated. Their air defenses, our air power. And so we did what is called deconfliction. I can't tell you what will be the outcome of the Russian involvement in Syria. It's too early to say. But I can tell you that I defined Israel's interests under any scenario. Whether a deal will be struck and implemented in Syria or not, that deal, if so implemented, must have Israel's interests at the table. And that means that we cannot accept a resolution in Syria that continues to enable Iran and Hezbollah to use Syria to attack Israel and to use Syrian territory as a passage for arms for another front in Israel against a Lebanese front against Israel. We will continue to defend our interests.
Israel responded furiously to the recent EU move to label products in the settlements, from the settlements. But beyond the condemnation, is there anything in practical terms that we can do to fight or prevent the decision? And how will this decision impact Israel's relationship with the EU going forward?
Well, I think condemnation is very important. You know, when somebody does something outrageous, you say it. You don't say, oh, well, okay, let it pass. It's outrageous. It should be said so. It's outrageous, first of all, because it's unfair. It's unfair to, again, to blame the victim. It's unfair because it is skipped the double standard. It's not even a triple standard. I mean, there are 200 territorial conflicts raging in the world, and the EU chooses to label products from Jewish products from the West Bank. You know how many West Banks there are in the world? And in far different circumstances, much more grievous circumstances, this is what they choose to do. So it's obvious singling out, and they'll jump in hoops and try to explain to you why this is different. Come on. You can say anything, but the truth is evident. It's singling out Israel without a common criteria, with a special criteria for the Jewish state. They say it's because of their frustration that the conflict is not solved. Their frustration? We're 100 years here fighting for our lives against this Palestinian rejection. Believe me, we're frustrated. Yeah. Maybe we should never mind. I mean, this is absolutely absurd. It's particularly absurd, but I think it's morally abhorrent too. It's morally abhorrent because on the soil of Europe, within living memory, Jewish products were labeled. Jewish stores were labeled. And I'd expect, with all the frustration, for Europe not to adopt this heinous act which has such horrible historical overtones. In practical terms, it won't affect our economy. It's a minuscule part of our exports. Israel's economy is very strong. You know, we're opening markets to small countries in Asia, Japan, China, India, in a big way. And of course, in Latin America too. I should add Africa because they're all coming back and they say, come back Israel, come back Israel. So I think there's a diversification of our economy. It's happening anyway. It's accelerating because of this. And I don't think that our economy is going to be hurt. I think, if anything, Palestinian employment, the Palestinian economy will be somewhat hurt by this, because for them, any employment or any effect on employment is much more powerful and more significant than on us. But what I find objectionable here is the triple standard applied to Israel, the singling out of Israel, the moral overtones. I think the EU bureaucracy has crossed the line here, to put it mildly. Crossed the line.
We just have a few more minutes. Turkey's President Erdogan just consolidated his hold on power there. While he's in office, have you written off ties with Turkey, or do you see any chance at all of rescuing any kind of a relationship with Ankara?
Your audience may not be aware of the fact that trade with Turkey, I think, is at an all-time high. Some tourism is resumed. I'd say the economic relations actually are surprisingly strong because markets have a way to operate on their own, which is also related to the previous question. You know, many countries will not participate in a boycott, even symbolic, of Israel, because they don't want to boycott themselves. They need from Israel typically three things: Israeli technology, Israeli technology, and Israeli technology. And they're not about to walk away from it. Eric Schmidt of Google told me that Israel is the most powerful global center of technology. And I said, Eric, you're overstating it. He said, no, I'm not. I said, I'm not. And just to give you an idea of our relative power, in 2014, Israel received 10% of the global investment in cybersecurity. That's a lot. That's 100 times our size in the world population. In 2015, that number changed. It's doubled. We received 20% of the world's global investment in cybersecurity. In cyber, we're punching 200 times above our weight. So maybe Mr. Schmidt had a point. And I think that this will be reflected in our economic prowess, in our ability to diversify our markets. That relates to the previous question, but also relates to this one. The forces of economics are working. So we have that relationship with Turkey. There is a question which Minister Steinitz, our energy minister, is dealing with, which is the question of the gas that Oh, we're going to conclude a gas deal very soon, as you know. Are you aware of this? Yeah. And contrary to the protests, within a year or 2 years, people are going to look back and they say, how could we not do this? How could we protest against this? This will be tremendous for the Israeli people, for lowering our energy rates, for bringing in hundreds of billions of shekels to the Israeli coffers. 60% of any shekel is gone of gas revenues goes to the Israeli people directly, not to the companies. It's huge. It's a tremendous boost for growth. There is the possibility of examining the possible cooperation with Turkey of this. So these are 2 issues. Third, the developments in Syria, and especially the possibility that Iran will gain a permanent foothold and a much more powerful foothold in Syria, is something that obviously concerns us, but I think also concerns Syria quite a bit. So,
Turks.
The Turks quite a bit. So, at least on the face of it, it looks like we could have common interests. Common interests don't always make for a workable policy. It's something that we'll examine because we also have conflicting interests. And the most obvious conflicting interest is the fact that Hamas has been working in Syrian territory to actively foment terrorist attacks against Israel, actively direct terrorist attacks against Israel. And so we're examining this question. We're not fixated. We're looking at the changing scene and seeing how we can, as I said before, diversify our markets, establish new friendships, or rekindle old relationships if possible. Whatever we're doing, we have our face, our gaze to the horizon, but our feet on the ground. Statesmanship requires that you're firmly connected to reality. Otherwise, you're in a balloon that loses contact with Earth. We don't lose contact with reality. We know we live in a tough neighborhood. We know that Zionism has been fighting against those who wish to uproot us from here for 100 years. We've been able to defend our country, establish its independence, develop it, seek peace and achieve peace with 2 of our neighbors, but we did not precondition at any time the rise of Zionism or the future of the Jewish state on the acceptance of our neighbors. We hope that that will happen, but we never made it a precondition. Otherwise, the state would not have been founded. Otherwise, the state would not exist. The most important thing is to solidify our country, to make it richer, stronger, more powerful. Soon there will be 10 million Israelis with $500 billion GDP. That's a good way to move into this first half of this century. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll show the Prime Minister respect as he leaves the room.